At my will reading, my kids fought over my dusty tools and old truck. My daughter sneered, "He left us with nothing but junk." That's when my lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Now, let's discuss Mr. Harrison's offshore accounts, totaling $30 million. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. From where I am now, the world of the living looks quiet, muted. I'm watching my own will reading, and it feels like a play scene from a great distance. The sound turned down low. The office of my lawyer, my oldest and dearest friend, Elias Thorne, is exactly as I remember it, paneled in dark, rich mahogany, smelling of old leather and even older paper. It's a room built for weighty pronouncements, for the final solemn accounting of a life. And there they are. My children, Gregory and Cynthia, my son and my daughter. My greatest achievements and my most profound disappointments. They are sitting in the high-backed leather chairs opposite Elias's desk, their bodies radiating a tense, bored impatience. They think this is a waste of a perfectly good Tuesday afternoon, a final pointless formality in the long drawn-out business of my dying. Gregory, my son, 48 years old and already looking worn down by a life of quiet resentment, keeps checking the expensive watch on his wrist. He's a branch manager at a big-box hardware chain, a corporate cog in a machine that sells the cheap, disposable versions of the things I used to sell. He sees my life's work not as a foundation, but as a cage he was lucky to escape. He believes I owed him more, and he is here today in the faint, foolish hope that I have posthumously come to my senses and left him a windfall. Cynthia, my Cindy, 45 and polished to a high, brittle sheen, is trying very hard not to let her surroundings touch her. She keeps shifting in her chair, her expensive silk dress rustling against the old leather. She looks at the dusty law books on Elias's shelves, at the worn patch on the Persian rug, with a look of undisguised contempt. She is married to a successful dentist, and her life is a carefully curated performance of upper-middle-class Charleston society. In her play I was the embarrassing blue-collar backstory she had to overcome. She is here today to collect whatever small embarrassing inheritance I have left. A final messy loose end to be tied up and forgot. I watch them, and I feel not anger but a deep, weary sorrow. I loved them. I still do. But the children I raised, the ones who had grease on their knees and laughter in their eyes, are gone. They were replaced, slowly, over the years by these two strangers, these hungry ghosts of wanting, who could look at a life of hard work and quiet dignity, and see only failure. Elias, dear Elias, sits behind his desk, a bastion of old-world calm and integrity. He knows the truth. He is the only one who does. He is the co-architect of my final lesson, the master of ceremonies for this last grand act of theater. He adjusts his reading glasses, looks at my two impatient children, and I can almost feel his grim satisfaction. The show is about to begin. As Elias clears his throat, preparing to read, my mind drifts back. Not in a flash, but in a slow, warm tide of memory. I see my store, Harrison's Hardware and Repair. Not a big, soulless warehouse, but a real hardware store, the kind that's mostly gone now. The floors were worn, dark wood, and the air was a permanent, intoxicating perfume of sawdust, machine oil, and fresh-cut keys. I loved that smell. It was the smell of possibility, of things being built and things being fixed. My hands. I remember my hands. They were never clean. There was always a line of grease under the nails, a callus on the thumb from a stubborn wrench. They were the hands of a man who worked, who created, who solved problems, and my children were ashamed of them. I remember Cindy, she must have been 16, when I came to pick her up from her fancy private school, in my old Ford F-150. The truck was my partner, my workhorse. It was 30 years old, a little rusty, but the engine, I had rebuilt that engine myself. It purred like a kitten. She saw me pull up, saw her friends and their parents' shiny new BMWs and Mercedes, and the look of pure mortified horror on her face. It's a memory that has never quite faded. She made me park a block away and walk to the truck, her head down as if she were walking to her own execution. "Daddy," she'd hissed as she got in, throwing her book bag on the seat between us, "can't you at least wash this thing? It's disgusting." I looked at my truck, at the honest, hard-working dirt that coated its sides, and then I looked at my daughter, and for the first time, I realized we were speaking different languages. Gregory was quieter in his contempt, but it was there. He went to college, got his business degree, and I was so proud. I thought he would join me at the store, that we would become Harrison and Son. I offered it to him. He had laughed, not a cruel laugh, but a pitying one. Dad, he'd said, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of condescending affection. It's a great hobby for you, but it's not a future. It's a relic. The world is about volume, about supply chains, about marketing. You're selling hammers one at a time. It's quaint. That was my life's work. My independence, my pride. It was quaint. They never understood. They never saw the quiet discipline, the simple, profound joy in a job well done. They only saw the surface, the dust, the grease, the lack of a country club membership. They saw a life of scarcity, because they measured a life in things, in what was spent. They never once thought to measure a life in what was saved, in what was built, quietly, patiently, in the dark. I started my secret life in night. An old customer, a retired stockbroker, used to come into the store just to talk. He saw something in me, a patience, a meticulous attention to detail. You're a smart man, Arthur, he told me one day. You see how things work. You should apply that to money. He taught me the basics. He told me about a few small, unknown tech companies out on the West Coast. Little startups with funny names. One was named after a piece of fruit. Another was making software for the new personal computer. I took the small profits from my store, the money I didn't need for the mortgage or for the kids' clothes, and I started to buy a few shares. Not much. $100 here, $500 there. It was a game at first, a hobby. I lived the same life. I drove the same truck. I wore the same work boots. But in a quiet, secret corner of my world, a seed I had planted had begun to grow, and my children, in their willful, arrogant blindness, never once saw the forest for the trees. Elias's voice, a deep, formal baritone, cut through my reverie, pulling me back to the stuffy, wood-paneled office. He had put on his reading glasses and was holding the will, a thick sheaf of high-quality, watermarked paper. We are gathered here today, he began, the old familiar legal preamble, to execute the last will and testament of Arthur Mellick Harrison, who, being of sound mind and body, did declare this to be his final disposition of all worldly assets. I watched my children. The feigned solemnity was already wearing thin. Gregory was tapping his foot, a restless, impatient rhythm on the old Persian rug. Cindy was examining her perfectly manicured nails, her expression one of profound, utter boredom. They wanted him to get to the numbers they were sure would be disappointingly, embarrassingly small, as per Mr. Harrison's explicit instructions. Elias continued, his gaze flicking up to look at them over the rim of his glasses. We will begin with the disposition of his primary, tangible assets located within the state of South Carolina. He cleared his throat and began to read from the document. To my son Gregory Arthur Harrison, I bequeath a 50% ownership stake in the business known as Harrison's Hardware and Repair, located at 1423 Meeting Street, Charleston, including all inventory, equipment, and accounts receivable. Gregory's face fell. It was a subtle but definite collapse of features, the hopeful, greedy tension in his jaw slackening into a look of pure, unadulterated disappointment. A 50% stake in a quaint business he considered a failure. It was not a gift. It was a burden. And to my daughter Cynthia Marie Harrison Price, Elias continued, his voice an even relentless monotone, I bequeath the remaining 50% ownership stake in the business known as Harrison's Hardware and Repair, with all the same inclusions. Cindy didn't even try to hide her disgust. A small, unladylike sneer curled her lip. She looked at her brother, silent, shared communication of their mutual misfortune. Furthermore, Elias read on, to my children, Gregory and Cynthia, to be shared equally, I bequeath my primary residence, located at 84 Rutledge Avenue, Charleston, and all of its contents, including all furniture, tools, personal effects, and the 1995 Ford F-50 pickup truck currently parked at the residence. The truck. He had mentioned the truck specifically. I smiled from my distant spectral vantage point. That had been my little touch. A final gentle poke at their life of curated shiny perfection. Elias set the first page of the will aside. This concludes the disposition of Mr. Harrison's primary assets, he said, his voice flat. For a moment, there was silence. Gregory and Cindy just stared at him, waiting for the next part. for the announcement of the bank accounts, the investment portfolios, the real money. When it became clear that Elias was not going to continue, that this was in fact all there was, the fragile performative veneer of their grief, finally completely and spectacularly shattered, the real show was about to begin. The silence in the room stretched for a full 10 seconds, a thick, heavy thing, pregnant with a disappointment so profound it was almost comical. And then, it broke. That's it? Cindy's voice was a high, incredulous squeak. She looked from Elias to her brother, her perfectly made-up face, a mask of shocked disbelief. That's everything? A failing store and that pile of rust he called a truck? You've got to be joking. I can assure you, Mrs. Price, I am not joking, Elias said, his voice a cool, flat counterpoint to her rising hysteria. This is the will your father wrote and signed. But what about his savings? Gregory demanded, his voice a low, angry growl. He had moved past disappointment, and was now firmly in the territory of a righteous, aggrieved fury. He worked his entire life. There has to be more than this. A retirement account? A pension? Something? Your father, Elias said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge, was a small business owner. His assets were tied up in his store and his home. The documents are all here. Everything is accounted for. The reality of their situation began to sink in, and like two cornered animals, they turned on each other. Well, I am not dealing with that store, Cindy declared, crossing her arms over her chest in a gesture of childish defiance. It's a filthy, dusty old fire trap. And it's in a terrible neighborhood. You'll have to handle the liquidation, Gregory. It's more your world, anyway. The insult, with its subtle but clear classist jab, landed its mark. Gregory's face flushed a deep, angry red. My world, he shot back. I manage a multi-million-dollar retail branch. Cynthia, I don't peddle nuts and bolts to old men. I don't have time to sort through 40 years of his hoarded junk. You're the one with all the free time. You can handle it. I have a life. She shrieked. I have social obligations. I am not spending my autumn sorting through greasy tools and God knows what else in that tiny, cluttered house. And that truck, we'll have to pay someone to haul it to a junkyard. It's an embarrassment. It was his life, Cindy, Gregory yelled, his voice now a full-throated roar of frustration. This is what he was. A simple, broke old man who cared more about fixing a lawnmower than he did about building a real future for his own children. I watched them. My two beautiful, successful children, and my heart ached with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight. They were not just arguing about a store or a truck. They were arguing about me, about the life I had chosen, a life they had so profoundly misunderstood, so deeply resented. They were not just rejecting my possessions. They were rejecting the very essence of who I was. They saw my simple life, not as a choice, but as a failure. A failure that they were now being forced to clean up. The grief for their father, if there had ever been any, was completely gone, incinerated in the hot, selfish fire of their own disappointed greed. They were not children mourning a parent. They were vultures, fighting over a carcass that had turned out to be far smaller than they had anticipated. Elias just sat behind his desk, his face a mask of stoic, sorrowful patience. He was letting them play it out. He was letting them reveal the full, ugly, unvarnished truth of their own characters. He was, as we had planned, giving them all the rope they needed to hang themselves, and they were busy, with a furious, bickering efficiency, tying their own nooses. The argument escalated, their voices rising in the quiet, wood-paneled office, a symphony of greed and grievance. They were no longer just bickering about logistics. They were litigating a lifetime of perceived slights, of resentments that had been simmering for decades. He never helped us. Gregory raged, his face contorted in a mask of self-pity. Do you know how hard it was for me to get the down payment for my first house? I was working 60 hours a week, and he was down at that store tinkering with some old piece of junk, acting like he didn't have a spare dime in the world. Tell me about it. Cindy chimed in, finding common ground in their shared sense of victimhood. When I was planning my wedding, I asked him for a little help with the venue. A decent contribution. He gave me $5,000. $5,000. For his only daughter's wedding. It was humiliating. The Prices probably thought my family was destitute. I listened from my silent, unseen perch, and I felt a profound sense of wonder at the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their revisionist history. I remembered that down payment. I had offered Gregory a loan, interest-free from the business. He had refused it, too proud, or perhaps too ashamed, to be seen taking a handout from his failed father. I remembered that wedding. I had not just given her $5,000. I had paid entirely for her wedding dress, a ridiculously expensive confection of lace and silk she had fallen in love with. And I had paid for the entire honeymoon, a 2-week trip to Italy that she had described, upon her return, as adequate. They had conveniently forgotten all of it. Their memories had been scrubbed clean of any instance of my generosity, leaving only a polished, self-serving narrative of their own struggle against the tide of my stinginess. "So what are we going to do?" Gregory demanded, turning his frustration on Elias. "What's the process here? We just sell everything and split whatever pennies are left." "That is the standard procedure, yes," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "Fine," Cindy said, standing up, the picture of a woman at the end of her rope. She smoothed the front of her expensive dress, a gesture of profound, theatrical disgust. "Let's just get it over with. I'll call a junk removal service for the house and the truck. And Gregory, you can deal with the store, sell it for whatever you can get. I don't care. I just want this to be over." She looked around the office, at the dusty books, at the old, comfortable leather chairs, at Elias, at her brother, at the entire messy, unsophisticated business of her father's life and death. And then, with a final contemptuous sneer, she delivered the line that was the culmination of a lifetime of shame and entitlement. The line that was the perfect, ugly, and ultimately self-destructive summary of her entire worldview. "For God's sake, Gregory," she said, her voice dripping with a venomous final disdain, "just get rid of it all. He left us with nothing but junk." The word hung in the silent office. Junk. My life's work. My treasured possessions. My memories. The very essence of my being. It was all just junk. It was the cruelest, most dismissive, and most profoundly untrue epitaph a child could ever deliver for a parent. And it was the precise, perfect cue for the final, devastating act of my play to begin. The word junk landed on the polished surface of Elias Thorne's desk, and lay there, a small, ugly, and deeply revealing thing. Gregory just nodded in weary agreement, too consumed by his own disappointment to register the profound disrespect of his sister's statement. They were united, at last, in their shared contempt for my life. And then, Elias moved. It was a piece of pure, beautiful, and perfectly executed theater, a performance we had rehearsed in our minds a dozen times. He did not speak. He simply stopped. He let Cindy's final damning verdict on my life hang in the air, allowing its ugliness to fully permeate the quiet, wood-paneled room. He leaned back in his large, creaking leather chair. The sound was a low, mournful groan, as if the chair itself was sighing at the state of the world. He slowly, deliberately took off his reading glasses. He held them up to the light from the window, squinting at a non-existent smudge on the lens. He then produced a small, clean, white handkerchief from his breast pocket. He began to polish the glasses, his movements slow, methodical, and utterly infuriating to my two impatient children. He polished one lens, then the other, his expression one of deep scholarly concentration, as if he were a museum curator handling a priceless artifact. I watched Gregory's foot begin to tap its impatient rhythm again. Cindy let out a loud, theatrical sigh and crossed her arms, the picture of a busy, important woman being held hostage by a slow, doddering old man. They thought he was just old. They thought he was just inefficient. They had no idea he was a master of the dramatic pause, a conductor building the silence to a fever pitch before the crash of the cymbals. After what felt like an eternity, Elias seemed satisfied with the state of his glasses. He folded the handkerchief with a crisp, geometric precision and tucked it back into his pocket. He placed the glasses on the desk beside the will. Then he reached for the crystal glass of water that had been sitting, untouched, at his elbow. He lifted it to his lips and took a long, slow, deliberate sip. I could hear the sound of him swallowing in the dead, silent room. He set the glass down, the soft click of crystal on wood a sound as loud as a gunshot. He looked at my children. He looked at their annoyed, bored, and deeply disrespectful faces. And for the first time since the reading began, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. It was not a smile of humor. It was the grim, satisfied smile of a man who is about to deliver a checkmate he has been planning for 20 moves. He had given them every opportunity to show a flicker of grace, of respect, of simple human decency. They had failed the test at every single turn. Their final contemptuous dismissal of my life as junk was the last piece of evidence he needed. The case for the prosecution was complete. It was time for the sentencing. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped together. He looked at Gregory. Then he looked at Cindy. His voice when he finally spoke was no longer the dry, monotonous voice of a lawyer reading a will. It was the quiet, clear, and utterly commanding voice of a man about to change the world. "Now," he said, his gaze as sharp and as piercing as a hawk's. "Let's discuss the second part of the estate." The statement hung in the air, a quiet, simple, and utterly baffling collection of words. The second part of the estate. Gregory and Cindy exchanged a look of pure, uncomprehending confusion. "The second part?" Gregory asked, his voice a mixture of annoyance and a faint, flickering curiosity. "What are you talking about? You said that was everything." "I said," Elias corrected him gently, his voice precise and deliberate, "that I had concluded the disposition of your father's primary, tangible assets. The assets located within the state of South Carolina. I said nothing about his other holdings. His less tangible assets." A new kind of silence fell over the room. Not the bored, impatient silence from before. This was a tense, expectant silence, the kind of quiet that falls over a courtroom just before a verdict is read. Elias, with the timing of a master actor, paused for a beat. He then put his freshly polished reading glasses back on, picked up the second, much thinner sheaf of papers that had been lying on his desk, and looked at them. His voice when he spoke again was calm, steady, and utterly matter-of-fact. It was the voice of a man reading a weather report, and it was the voice that would forever alter the course of my children's lives. "Now," he said, clearing his throat, "let's discuss the second part of the estate. Let's discuss Mr. Harrison's offshore accounts, totaling $30,742,000. The number, the sheer impossible astronomical size of it, was a physical blow. It was a sonic boom that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. For a full, silent, and deeply satisfying 10 seconds, my children did not move. They did not speak. They just stared at Elias Thorne, their faces a comical, almost grotesque tableau of shock and disbelief. Gregory's jaw had literally dropped open. His mouth was a perfect slack-jawed O of astonishment. His carefully constructed mask of aggrieved disappointment had been completely shattered, leaving only the raw, naked face of a man who has just been told the fundamental laws of physics have been repealed. Cindy's reaction was even more profound. All the color drained from her face. Her perfect spray-tanned complexion turned a pale, sickly ashen gray. Her hands, which had been crossed so defiantly over her chest, came up to her mouth, as if to stifle a scream, or perhaps to keep her own heart from leaping out of her chest. "$30 million?" she finally whispered, the words a dry, incredulous croak. "Dollars? And $742,000. Elias added, with a small, precise nod. "To be exact. That's not possible," Gregory stammered, shaking his head, as if to clear it of this impossible, wonderful, and terrifying new reality. "My father, he was a hardware store owner. He drove a 30-year-old truck. He was broke. He was always broke." "Your father," Elias said, and his voice was now laced with a deep, profound, and utterly undisguised contempt, "was not broke, Mr. Harrison. Your father was disciplined. There is a very, very significant difference. He chose to live a life of simplicity. He did not choose to live a life of poverty." He let that sink in, a final damning indictment of their own shallow, materialistic worldview. They had looked at their father's simple life and had seen only failure. They had never once considered that it might have been a choice, a strategy, a triumph of will. "I don't believe you," Cindy said, her voice a thin, reedy thing. She was looking at Elias as if he were a con man, a trickster. "This is some kind of sick joke." "A joke?" Elias said, and his cold, quiet smile returned. "Mrs. Price, your father was a man of many wonderful qualities, but a sense of humor, particularly of this magnitude, was not one of them." And with that, he turned the large, high-resolution monitor on his desk so that it was facing them. "But please," he said, his voice as smooth as silk, "don't take my word for it. Let's look at the junk." The monitor glowed to life, and the stuffy, wood-paneled law office was suddenly filled with the cold, hard, and irrefutable light of the digital age. Elias's fingers moved deftly across his keyboard, a quiet, rhythmic clicking that was the only sound in the dead, silent room. He was navigating through layers of encrypted security, a digital fortress I had designed with him years ago. First, a login screen appeared for a private bank in Zurich, Switzerland. The logo was discreet, elegant, the very picture of old-world money. Elias typed in a long, complex password. The screen refreshed, and a bank statement appeared, the numbers stark and black against the white background. At the top of the page was my name, Arthur M. Harrison. And at the bottom, the account balance. I watched my children's faces. Their expressions were almost identical. A slack-jawed, hypnotic stare, as if they were looking into the face of God, or the devil. Their minds, which had been so full of their own petty grievances just minutes before, were now completely utterly blank, short-circuited by a number they could not comprehend. Elias didn't say a word. He just let them stare. He let the reality of the numbers seep into their souls. Then with another series of clicks, he closed the Swiss portal and opened another. This one was for a holding company in the Cayman Islands. A different logo, a different set of passwords, the same staggering result. This account held my stock portfolio, a dizzying list of blue-chip tech companies, international infrastructure bonds, and emerging market funds. The current valuation, displayed at the bottom of the screen in a crisp, unforgiving font, was 18. Gregory made a small, choking sound as if he were trying to swallow and breathe at the same time. Cindy had stopped breathing altogether. She was just staring, her eyes wide, her perfectly applied lipstick a stark, garish slash of color on her pale, bloodless face. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum. A profound, echoing void, where their old reality had been just minutes before. In that void, 1,000 questions were being born. How? Why? When? Their entire understanding of their father, of their lives, of their own identities had been built on the foundational truth of his humble, simple, and slightly embarrassing poverty. That foundation had just been revealed to be a lie of $30 million. They looked from the glowing screen to Elias, and then slowly, fearfully, as if expecting to see a ghost, they looked at the empty chairs where they had been sitting. It was as if they could feel my presence in the room, the quiet, patient, and deeply disappointed ghost of the man they had never known. Their father, the man who wore work boots and smelled of sawdust, the man who drove a rusty old truck, the man who they had just declared had left them nothing but junk, was one of the wealthiest men they had ever known, and they had been complaining to him about his inability to help with a down payment. They had been sneering at his $5,000 wedding gift. The shame, I could see, was beginning to dawn. A hot, red flush was creeping up Gregory's neck. Cindy's eyes were glistening with a strange, unreadable moisture. Was it tears of joy, or tears of a profound, soul-deep humiliation? The silence stretched on, a long, uncomfortable, and deeply satisfying minute. They had been judged by their own words, by their own values, and they had been found wanting. The sound of their world breaking was the most profound and most satisfying silence I had ever heard. The silence was finally broken by Gregory. He pushed himself out of his chair and walked, as if in a trance, towards Elias's desk. He leaned over the monitor, his face just inches from the screen, his eyes scanning the dizzying columns of numbers, the names of international banks, the logos of multinational corporations. He was searching for a flaw, a trick, a sign that this was all an elaborate, cruel joke. This can't be real, he whispered, his voice a hoarse, shaky thing. Where did this come from? How is this possible? It's possible, Gregory, I said, my voice filling the room, not from my ghostly perch, but from the memories Elias was about to share. My story, my real story. Elias leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm, professorial authority. He had been my friend, but he had also been my student in the art of quiet, patient strategy. Your father, he began, his voice taking on a narrative, storytelling quality, was a man of remarkable and deeply underestimated intelligence. And he was a man of profound discipline. He believed in a simple philosophy: live humbly, work hard, and let your money work for you untouched and unseen. He gestured to the screen. This did not happen overnight. This was the work of 40 years. It began with a few $100s, a small speculative investment in a fledgling computer company. In California, a company started by a couple of young men in a garage. Your father saw the future when others saw only a hobbyist's toy. The computer company, of course, was Apple. He took the small, steady profits from his hardware store, Elias continued, and he did not buy a new truck. He did not join the country club. He did not renovate the house. He invested. Quietly. Patiently. He educated himself. He spent his evenings not in front of a television, but reading financial journals, studying international markets. He bought into a small unknown software company in Seattle. He invested in a South Korean manufacturing firm when no one else would touch it. He was a financial ghost, his transactions routed through layers of corporate entities, his fortune growing in the dark, like a mushroom in a damp cellar. Gregory and Cindy had returned to their chairs, but they were not sitting. They were perched on the edge, their bodies leaning forward, their faces a mixture of awe, greed, and a dawning, terrible shame. They were finally beginning to understand. Their father had not been a simple man. He had been a secret genius, a financial wizard hiding in plain sight, disguised as a humble hardware store owner. He never touched the principal, Elias said, his voice laced with a deep, profound respect. He lived his entire life on the modest income from his store. The fortune you see here, this is the interest, the compound interest on a lifetime of quiet, disciplined, and utterly brilliant decision-making. The proof was undeniable. It was all there. The transaction histories, the stock certificates held in digital vaults, the correspondence with Swiss bankers. It was a secret parallel life, a life of immense, staggering wealth that had run concurrently with the simple, dusty, and deeply authentic life they had known and despised. The initial shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a new, frantic, and deeply greedy energy. The shame was still there, a faint, rosy blush on their cheeks, but it was being rapidly eclipsed by the dazzling, hypnotic light of $30 million. So, it's ours? Cindy asked, her voice a breathless, hopeful whisper. All of it? She looked around the stuffy old office, as if seeing it for the first time, not as a symbol of her father's failure, but as the antechamber to her new, unimaginably wealthy life. Gregory was already doing the math in his head. 15 million for him. 15 for her. His mind was racing with the possibilities. A new house. A new car. A new life. Freedom from the soul-crushing mediocrity of his middle management job. They looked at Elias, their eyes shining with a pure, unadulterated avarice. They had processed the miracle. They were ready to claim their prize. They were about to learn that their father's final lesson had only just begun. As Elias let them marinate in the intoxicating possibility of their newfound wealth, my own voice, my own story filled the spaces between the clicking of his keyboard. I took them back to a time they couldn't remember, a time of rotary phones, in a world that was still analog. I showed them a younger me, Arthur Harrison, in my early 30s, a man with a young family, a struggling new business, and a mind that was always working, always seeing the patterns in things. I wasn't just a handyman, I was a systems analyst. I saw the world as a series of interconnected machines, and I had a gift for understanding how they worked, whether it was the internal combustion engine of a Ford truck, or the delicate invisible machinery of the global economy. My tutelage had come from an unlikely source, Mr. Abernathy, a retired stockbroker who was one of my first and most loyal customers. He was a lonely old widower who would come into the store just to talk, to escape the silence of his big, empty house. He saw my meticulous nature, the way I organized my inventory, the way I could diagnose a problem with a piece of equipment just by listening to it. "You've got a good brain, Arthur," he told me one rainy Tuesday afternoon, as I was rethreading a stripped bolt for him. "You see the logic in things? You ever think about applying that logic to something bigger than nuts and bolts?" He became my secret mentor. He would bring me his copy of the Wall Street Journal, with articles circled and notes scribbled in the margins. He taught me about price-to-earnings ratios, about market capitalization, about the magical, transformative power of compound interest. He gave me my first piece of advice. "Don't invest in what you know, Arthur," he said. "Invest in what your children will know. Invest in the future." So I did. I took $200, a small fortune for me at the time, money that should have gone to a new water heater, and I bought a handful of shares in a company that was making personal computers in a garage. My wife, God rest her soul, had thought I was a fool. "Computers are a fad, Arthur," she had said. "Buy the water heater." I bought the stock instead. We took cold showers for a month. That was the beginning. Every spare dollar, every small, Unexpected profit from the store went into that secret growing fund. I became a ghost in the financial world. I opened my first offshore account with the help of a discreet, old-school banker Mr. Abernathy had recommended. It felt like something out of a spy movie, but it was real. My children saw none of this. They saw their father in his dusty overalls, his hands stained with grease. They saw the old truck, the modest house, the vacations we took to the state park, instead of to Europe. They saw a life of scrimping and saving, and they interpreted it as a life of lack. They never saw it for what it was, a life of profound, deliberate, and deeply satisfying discipline. They didn't see the nights I spent at the kitchen table after they were asleep, poring over annual reports from companies in Japan and Germany, my mind traveling the world while my body was firmly planted in Charleston. They didn't see the quiet, thrilling joy I felt when a small speculative bet on a new kind of cellular technology paid off, not just tenfold but 100-fold. My fortune grew in silence, a vast, subterranean river of wealth, flowing beneath the simple, solid ground of my everyday life. And the more it grew, the more committed I became to my simple existence. The wealth was never the point. The point was the game, the strategy, the quiet, intellectual satisfaction of seeing the patterns, of understanding the machine. The money was just how you kept score. My children, however, were obsessed with the score. But they wanted to win without ever learning the rules of the game. They wanted the prize without the effort. And so I made a decision. The money would not be a gift. It would be a lesson. My final and most important lesson. A lesson in the difference between being rich and having wealth. And that lesson was about to begin. The greedy, ecstatic light in my children's eyes was almost painful to watch. They were already spending the money in their heads, their minds racing with visions of new cars, bigger houses, a life of effortless, luxurious ease. They were like two lottery winners, their brains short-circuited by a sudden, unearned and unimaginable windfall. It was Elias who brought them crashing back to earth. He waited until their giddy, whispered calculations had reached a fever pitch. He watched them, a silent, sorrowful judge, as they completely and utterly revealed the shallow, materialistic nature of their souls. And then, he held up a single imperious hand. However, he said, and the single word, spoken in his calm, authoritative voice, immediately silenced their frantic, joyful chatter. They both froze, their faces turning from the monitor to him, a new, unfamiliar emotion dawning in their eyes, suspicion. However, Elias repeated, drawing out the word, savoring the moment. Before we discuss the distribution of these assets, we must first discuss the conditions. Your father, as you may have gathered, was a man of considerable foresight. He did not amass this fortune by accident, and he was not about to see it squandered by accident, either. Conditions? Cindy asked, her voice sharp with a new defensive edge. What kind of conditions? The entire $30 million estate. Elias explained, picking up the second, thinner sheaf of papers from his desk, has been placed into a single, irrevocable trust. The Harrison Legacy Trust. I am the executor and the primary trustee, and according to the terms of this trust, you, his children, are the beneficiaries, but you have no direct access to the funds. Not yet. The funds will remain locked until certain stipulations have been met to my and the board's complete satisfaction. The board? Gregory sputtered, his face a mask of outrage. What board? It's our money. It is not your money, Mr. Harrison, Elias corrected him, his voice as cold and as hard as granite. It is your father's money, and he has dictated in this legally binding document the precise and non-negotiable terms under which you may, one day, be given the privilege of managing it. Your inheritance is not a gift. It is a test, and you are about to find out if you can pass. He looked at their stunned, furious faces, and I could feel his grim satisfaction from across the void. The first part of the lesson, the shock and awe, was over. The second, and far more difficult part, the part about humility and hard work, was just about to begin. They had been shown the promised land. Now they were about to be told they had to spend a year wandering in the desert to earn it. Elias let the reality of their new, powerless position sink in. He gave them a long moment to process the fact that they were no longer heirs to a fortune, but candidates in a bizarre, posthumous apprenticeship. He watched as their initial ecstatic greed curdled into a sullen, resentful fury. So what's the test? Gregory finally asked, his voice a low, angry growl. What hoops did the old man decide to make us jump through from beyond the grave? Elias chose to ignore the disrespect in his tone. He simply put on his reading glasses and read from the will, his voice a calm, relentless monotone that offered no room for argument. Condition the first, he began, to be eligible to inherit the principal of the Harrison Legacy Trust. My children, Gregory Harrison and Cynthia Harrison Price, must for a period of no less than 12 consecutive months abandon their current places of residence and their current forms of employment. Cindy let out a small, horrified gasp. Quit our jobs? Move? He can't be serious. Oh, he is perfectly serious, Elias said, not looking up from the page. The will continues, during this 12-month period, they will move into my residence at 84 Rutledge Avenue and will live there. Furthermore, they will take over the full personal and hands-on operation of my business, Harrison's Hardware and Repair. The room was silent for a moment, and then Cindy erupted in a peal of sharp, hysterical laughter. You've got to be kidding me, she said, her voice dripping with a contemptuous disbelief. He wants us to live in that shack and run that dusty old museum of his? He wants me to sell. I don't know, hammers. And you, Mr. Harrison, Elias continued, his gaze flicking to Gregory, will be in charge of the repair side of the business. Your father was quite specific. You will be expected to handle all customer repairs, from lawnmowers to leaky faucets. Personally, Gregory, the man who managed a staff of 50 and spent his days in a climate-controlled office, looking at spreadsheets, looked physically ill at the thought of having to touch a greasy engine. And what are we supposed to live on? He demanded. We have mortgages, car payments, lives. The will addresses that as well, Elias said, his voice maddeningly calm. During this 1-year period, you will be permitted to live only on the profits generated by the hardware store. You will be given a small, initial stipend from the trust to cover the store's operating expenses for the first month. After that, you are on your own. Your survival will be entirely dependent on your ability to successfully run the business you both so profoundly disdained. He took off his glasses and looked at them, his expression one of pure, unadulterated seriousness. He wants you to walk a year in his shoes, Elias said, his voice softening for the first time. He wants you to understand the dignity and the difficulty of the life he chose. He wants you to understand the value of a dollar that is earned through the sweat of your own brow, not just inherited. This is the first part of your test, and it is non-negotiable. They stared at him, their faces a mixture of fury, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible understanding. They were being sentenced to a year of hard labor, of humility, of living the very life they had spent their entire adult lives trying to escape. They were being forced to become their father, and the only thing more infuriating than the sentence was the fact that their own greed was forcing them to accept it. The full brutal scope of my plan was beginning to dawn on them, but the final, most important lesson was yet to come. They thought this was a test of endurance, a year-long sentence of hard labor after which they would be handed their prize. They were wrong. This was not a test of their endurance. It was a test of their character. Gregory, ever the pragmatist, was already trying to find the angles, the loopholes. Okay, he said, his voice a low, calculating thing. So we do it. We put our lives on hold for a year. We play shopkeeper. It'll be a sabbatical. And then at the end of the year, the trust is dissolved, and we get the money, right? A 50-50 split. Elias looked at him, and the small, cold smile returned to his lips. Not exactly, he said. He put his reading glasses back on and turned to the final page of the will. Condition the second, he read, his voice clear and deliberate. Upon the successful completion of the 12-month operational period, during which both beneficiaries must have remained in residence and actively employed at the store, they will not automatically receive the funds. Instead, they will be required to prepare and present a formal proposal to the Board of Trustees of the Harrison Legacy Trust. A proposal? Cindy asked, her voice a suspicious hiss. What kind of proposal? A proposal, Elias explained, taking his glasses off again and looking directly at them, detailing, in full, your plans for the $30 million inheritance. The will is very specific on this point. The proposal must outline a plan to use the funds to build something of lasting value, not just for yourselves, but for the community of Charleston. Your father suggests, but does not mandate, potential uses such as the creation of a charitable foundation, a fund for small business grants, or the establishment of a vocational school for the skilled trades. He let that sink in. The money was not for them to spend. It was for them to administer. They were not inheriting a fortune. They were being given a responsibility. The Board of Trustees, which consists of myself, the head of the Charleston Community Foundation, and your father's former accountant, Elias continued, will then review this proposal. We will assess it based on its creativity, its viability, and most importantly, its generosity of spirit. Your proposal will be your final exam. It will be the ultimate test of whether you have learned the lesson your father has tried to teach you. Gregory and Cindy just stared at him, their faces blank with a new, more profound level of shock. This was a layer of posthumous control that was beyond their comprehension. Their father wasn't just telling them how to earn the money, he was telling them how to spend it. And what if you don't like our proposal? Gregory asked, his voice barely a whisper. What if the board rejects it? Then you will be given one opportunity to revise it, based on our feedback, Elias said. And if that second proposal is also deemed to be insufficient, to be too self-serving, to not honor the spirit of your father's request. He paused, letting the unspoken threat hang in the air. The final terrible condition. The unspoken threat hung in the stuffy office, a final terrible sword of Damocles dangling over their heads. Cindy, who had been silent for several minutes, a storm of furious calculation raging behind her eyes, finally found her voice. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice a low, trembling thing. It's our inheritance. He can't control us from the grave. There have to be laws. We can contest this. We can fight it. Elias Thorne leaned back in his chair, his expression one of weary, almost pitying patience. You are, of course, free to do so, Mrs. Price, he said, his voice calm and reasonable. You can hire lawyers. You can drag your father's name and your own through a very public and very messy court battle. It will take years. It will cost you a fortune in legal fees you do not have. And in the end, you will lose. The Harrison Legacy Trust was designed by the best estate lawyers in the country. It is an ironclad, legally unassailable document. Your father made sure of that. He then reached for the will one last time. Which brings us, he said, with a sigh of finality, to the last clause, the alternative. He cleared his throat and read from the final page. In the event that either or both of my children refuse to accept the conditions laid out in this trust, or in the event that they fail to complete the full 12-month period of residency and employment, or in the event that their final proposal is rejected by the Board of Trustees, then the entirety of the trust's principal, all $30,742,000, shall be immediately and irrevocably liquidated and donated to a single entity, the South Carolina Fund for Vocational Education, to be used for the establishment of scholarships and small business grants for aspiring carpenters, plumbers, electricians, and mechanics. He set the will down on the desk with a soft final thud. The finality of it, the sheer ruthless brilliance of my posthumous plan, was absolute. I had left them no loopholes, no escape routes. They were presented with a stark, binary choice. They could choose pride. They could refuse my conditions, walk away from the junk I had left them, and in doing so, walk away from every single penny of the fortune. They could preserve their fragile, superficial status, and in return, they would get nothing. Or, they could choose greed. They could swallow their pride, endure a year of what they considered to be humiliating servitude, and try to convince a board of strangers that they had somehow miraculously developed a conscience. They could play the game, dance for my money, and hope that their performance was convincing enough to win them the prize. I had pitted their two most defining characteristics, their arrogance and their avarice, against each other in a battle for their own souls. I watched them as this final terrible clause settled over them. They looked at each other, and for the first time, I saw not just anger or greed in their eyes, but a flicker of something else, fear. The fear of a life without the safety net they had always taken for granted. The fear of being left with, as they had so poetically put it, nothing but junk. The choice was theirs. The free will I had always given them was still intact. But I had, from beyond the grave, stacked the deck. I had made it almost impossible for them to choose pride over the hypnotic, irresistible lure of $30 million. They were trapped, not by my will but by the shallow, materialistic nature of their own characters, and their torment was just beginning. The silence that followed the reading of the final clause was the silence of a checkmate. Gregory and Cindy were no longer bickering, no longer posturing. They were simply sitting there, two prisoners who had just had the full, inescapable reality of their sentence laid out before them. Gregory was the first to break. He let out a long, slow, and deeply defeated sigh. He scrubbed his hands over his face, the picture of a man whose entire world had just been turned upside down, shaken violently, and then set back down, rearranged in a new and deeply unpleasant configuration. "So that's it then," he said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. "We either become him for a year, or we get nothing." "That is a succinct and accurate summary of the situation." "Yes," Elias confirmed, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Cindy just stared into the middle distance, her mind clearly racing, her face a canvas of warring emotions. I could see the battle playing out in her eyes. The humiliation of having to live in my small, simple house. The horror of having to work in a dusty hardware store. The sheer galling injustice of it all. But then, I could also see the other side of the equation. The $30 million. The life of unimaginable luxury it could buy her. The freedom from her pleasant, but in her eyes profoundly mediocre existence. As a dentist wife, her pride was a powerful thing. Her shame, her lifelong embarrassment of my simple life, was a deep and defining part of her character. But I had made a bet. A final posthumous wager. I had bet that her greed was stronger. "It's a year," Gregory said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Just 1 year. 12 months. We could do it." He was trying to convince himself to frame the sentence not as a punishment, but as a challenge, a temporary inconvenience on the path to unimaginable wealth. "Do it?" Cindy finally spat, her voice a low, furious hiss. She turned on her brother, her eyes blazing with a wild, cornered animal fury. "Do you have any idea what you're saying, Gregory? He wants to humiliate us. This is his final sick joke. He wants to see us covered in sawdust and grease, living in that hovel. He wants to break us." "And what's the alternative, Cindy?" Gregory shot back, his own voice rising with a desperate, pragmatic anger. "We walk away? We let $30 million go to a bunch of strangers who want to be plumbers? After a lifetime of him pinching every penny, of him acting like he was destitute, we just let it all go? No, I will not." And there it was, the final decisive victory of avarice over arrogance. He had been insulted. He had been manipulated. But the lure of the money was simply too strong to resist. "He wins either way," Cindy said, her voice dropping to a bitter, defeated whisper. "If we walk away, he makes us look like fools who threw away a fortune. If we stay, he gets to laugh at us from beyond the grave, watching us play at being poor for a year." "Then we'll let him laugh," Gregory said, his jaw tight with a new, hard resolve. "We'll let him laugh all the way to the bank. We'll do the year. We'll run his stupid store. We'll live in his stupid house. We'll write the best damn charity proposal anyone has ever seen. And then we will take his money. We will take every last single cent. And we will spend it on everything he ever despised." It was a declaration of war, a promise of a final, Pyrrhic victory. They would endure the humiliation. They would play my game. But they would do it on their own terms, their hearts full not of a newfound respect, but of a deep, simmering, and patient rage. They were trapped, not by me, but by their own greed. They had made their choice. They had taken the bait. And now, the long, difficult, and deeply educational year of their lives was about to begin. The meeting concluded with a cold, formal efficiency. Elias laid out the logistical next steps. They were to give notice at their jobs and vacate their homes within 30 days. On the 1st of the following month, they would be given the keys to my house and my store. Their new lives would begin. They left his office not with the excited chatter of new lottery winners, but with the grim, sullen silence of 2 convicts being led to their prison cell. As they walked out the door, I watched them from my place beyond, and I saw the first tiny crack appear in their united front of resentful greed. "I am not cleaning out the garage," Cindy hissed at her brother as they waited for the elevator. "That is a man's job, and I suppose running the cash register is a woman's job?" Gregory retorted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Welcome to the real world, Cynthia. We're both going to get our hands dirty." Their first argument, of the many, many that were to come. I faded back. My presence in that stuffy old office no longer needed. My part was done. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the play, my final tragicomic play, was now in motion. From my new quiet vantage point, I watched them over the next few weeks. I watched them sell their expensive homes, their luxury cars. I watched them pack up their curated lives into boxes. I watched them on a gray and drizzly November morning, pull up to my small, simple house on Rutledge Avenue, not in a BMW or a Mercedes, but in a rented moving van. They stood on the sidewalk for a long time, just looking at the house, at the hardware store next door with its faded, hand-painted sign. They looked like two shipwrecked survivors who had just washed up on the shore of a strange and deeply unwelcome new world. I don't know if they will succeed. I don't know if a year of hard work, of simple living will be enough to scour the deep, corrosive rust of entitlement from their souls. I don't know if they will learn the lesson I have so desperately and so cruelly tried to teach them. Perhaps they will simply endure, their hearts hardening with every day that passes, and at the end of the year they will present a beautiful hollow proposal, and they will take my money, and they will go back to their old lives, only richer and more bitter than before. Or perhaps, just perhaps, something else will happen. Perhaps one day, Gregory will fix an engine and feel the quiet, profound satisfaction of making something broken work again. Perhaps, one day, Cindy will help an old woman find the perfect screw to fix her grandmother's rocking chair, and she will feel a flicker of the simple human joy of being useful. Perhaps, one day, they will look at the junk I left them and they will see not a burden but a legacy. I don't know, that is their story to write now, not mine. But as I watched them take the first, reluctant steps into their new, temporary life, I felt a sense of peace. I had left them with more than just a dusty hardware store and a rusty old truck. I had left him with more than just a $30 million fortune. I had left him with one last, difficult and almost impossible chance to learn the difference between what something costs and what it is truly worth. And for a father, that is the only inheritance that truly matters.